The Raven gang thought they'd found an easy target, a blind rancher in Thunder Valley who'd be helpless to stop them. They're about to learn how wrong they are. John Mason may have lost his sight to Outlaws' bullets 15 years ago, but in the darkness, he became something deadlier than any gunslinger in the West. He can hit a man's gun hand at 50 paces by sound alone, put 6 bullets through 6 bottles faster than men with perfect vision. Now, as these killers threaten his daughter and his land, they're about to discover why folks still whisper about Deadeye Mason, the blind lawman who never misses. This isn't just a story of revenge. It's about how the West's most vicious outlaws learned that a man's sight isn't in his eyes, it's in his soul. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Thunder Valley earned its name from the way sound echoed off its rocky walls, amplifying every noise until even a whisper could travel for miles. For John Mason, those echoes had become more than just sound. They were his eyes. 15 years of blindness had taught him to read the valley's voice like other men read books. Dawn was breaking over the ranch, though Mason couldn't see it. What he could hear was everything: the crunch of his boots on gravel, the distant lowing of cattle, the whisper of wind through pine needles, and the subtle change in birdsong that told him his daughter Sarah was approaching from the barn. Morning. "Papa!" she called, her footsteps light but sure on the packed earth. "Breakfast's nearly ready." Mason turned toward her voice, his weathered face creasing in a smile. At 55, his hair had gone grey at the temples, but his frame remained as solid as the valley's walls. The old gun belt at his hip still held, the same Colt he'd carried as a lawman, though now it was joined by a gnarled walking stick he rarely needed. "Already fed the horses," Sarah continued, falling into step beside him. "And Mr. Thompson's coming by later about those strays we found on the North Ridge." Mason nodded, hearing the unspoken tension in her voice. 3 of Thompson's cattle had wandered onto their land yesterday, or been driven there. It wasn't the first time recently that neighboring ranches had reported suspicious activity. "Anything else?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. Sarah had inherited more than just her mother's golden hair. She had Catherine's inability to hide her worries. "Riders came through town yesterday," she said finally. "Strangers. Jake at the general store says they were asking questions about the valley, about the ranches, about you." Mason's hand brushed the grip of his Colt, an old habit that had never quite died. "The Raven gang," he said quietly. "Word is they've been moving north, buying up ranches. Those that won't sell seem to have runs of bad luck." "Papa," Sarah started, but Mason held up a hand. His head tilted slightly. Something only those who knew him well would recognize as his way of focusing on distant sounds. "Riders coming," he said. 4 of them heavy horses, probably fresh from town. His fingers drummed thoughtfully on his walking stick. "Why don't you go inside, girl? Put that coffee on. Might be we have visitors." Sarah hesitated. She'd seen her father handle trouble before, seen him do things that should have been impossible for a man who couldn't see. But she'd also seen the scars he carried, reminders of the day Outlaws' bullets had taken his sight and her mother's life. "I can stay," she said firmly. Mason's smile returned, gentle but determined. "You're stubborn as your mother. But these need to see what they expect to see. A blind old rancher and his daughter. Makes them careless." The riders were closer now. Mason could hear the jingle of spurs, the creak of saddle leather. 4 men, he thought, but there were others hanging back. The gang never showed its full hand at once. "Go on now," he said softly. "Let's give our guests the welcome they deserve." As Sarah's footsteps retreated toward the house, Mason remained on the porch, one hand resting lightly on his walking stick. To anyone watching, he would appear vulnerable, perhaps even helpless. They wouldn't notice how his head turned slightly to track each rider's position, or how his free hand stayed close to his gun. The legend of Thunder Valley was about to grow, though not in the way the Raven Gang expected. They were about to learn what Mason had discovered in 15 years of darkness, that a man's eyes could deceive him, but the sound of a hammer being cocked always told the truth. The riders hadn't reached the ranch house yet when Mason heard Sarah moving upstairs, opening the hidden compartment behind her mother's old dresser. The familiar click of a Winchester rifle being loaded brought another smile to his face. His daughter had learned well. "Keep it hidden," he called softly, knowing she could hear him through the open window. "Let them think we're helpless." Mason shifted his stance slightly, adjusting to the morning breeze. The wind was his ally, carrying sounds from across the valley. Their visitors were trying to be quiet, but to Mason's trained ears, they might as well have been shouting their intentions. 2 men were riding ahead, scouts based on their lighter gear. Behind them, a heavier horse carrying what sounded like the leader, his saddle creaking under elaborate leather tooling and silver conchos. The 4th rider held back, his horse's gait suggesting a man used to moving in shadows. "Far enough, gentlemen," Mason called out when they reached the edge of his yard. He kept his voice mild, letting his walking stick tap obviously against the porch boards. Playing the part of a blind man was easy when you'd had 15 years to practice. "Mr. Mason?" The leader's voice was smooth, educated. "Hope we're not disturbing you too early. Name's James Raven." "Most folks introduce themselves before riding onto private property," Mason replied, his head tilted as if trying to place the voice's direction. In truth, he was mapping every man's position by their breathing, the shift of their horses, the subtle tells that sight-reliant men never noticed. "Our apologies." Boots hit dirt as Raven dismounted. "We're businessmen, Mr. Mason. Looking to invest in Thunder Valley? Heard you might be interested in selling." Sarah's breathing upstairs stayed steady. She'd positioned herself perfectly. Mason could tell from the way her scent carried on the wind that she had clear shots at all 4 men if needed. "Valley's been good to us," Mason said. "Not looking to sell." "Times are changing," Raven said, taking a step forward. His spurs rang differently now. He was shifting his weight, preparing for something. "Man in your condition might find it harder to keep up with the demands of ranching." Mason heard the subtle insult, the hint of threat beneath the polite words. He also heard the 2 scouts spreading out, trying to flank the porch. The 4th man hadn't moved, but his horse's bridle had jingled when he'd touched his gun. "Funny thing about conditions," Mason said, still smiling pleasantly. "They teach you things, like how a man planning trouble breathes different from a man planning business, or how a gun being eased from its holster sounds just like this. In one fluid motion, Mason's Colt cleared leather. He hadn't aimed with his eyes in 15 years, but he didn't need to. The sound of Raven's startled intake of breath, the position of his boots on the ground, the way his voice had carried, all of it painted a picture clearer than sight. The shot cracked across the yard. Raven's hat flew off his head. A neat hole. Punched through its crown. "That's one," Mason said quietly. His gun had already shifted, tracking the scouts by their panicked movements. "Care to try for 2 through 4? "Hold steady." Raven's voice had lost its smoothness. "Mr. Mason, clearly there's been a misunderstanding. We're just here to talk business." "Then talk," Mason replied. "But from there, any closer, and we'll have to discuss how a blind man put 6 bullets through 6 bottles at the county fair last." "Without reloading," the 4th rider finally spoke, his voice carrying the harsh edge of experience. "Boss, heard stories about this one before he lost his sight." "I know who he was," Raven snapped, then composing himself. "Mr. Mason, we'll call again when you've had time to consider our offer. Change is coming to Thunder Valley. Best be on the right side of it." Mason kept his gun steady until the riders were well away, tracking their retreat by sound. Only then did he holster the Colt, his movements as precise as ever. "Good shooting, Papa," Sarah said from the doorway. "Though, you did warn them about the bottles. Sometimes a warning saves trouble later," Mason replied. "But they'll be back. Men like that, they don't take no for an answer." He turned toward her voice, his expression serious. "Time to prepare, girl, like I taught you." Sarah's footsteps approached, and he felt her kiss his cheek. "Already started, Papa. Coffee's hot, and I've got your special targets set up out back, the ones that ring when you hit them." Mason nodded. The Raven gang had just learned he could shoot, but they hadn't learned how well. That lesson would come later, paid for in blood and regret. James Raven's rage filled the cramped room above the Thunder Valley saloon. The bottle he hurled shattered against the wall, making his men flinch. "A blind man!" He paced like a caged wolf. "A goddamn blind man made fools of us." Snake Harper, the experienced gunman who'd hung back during their visit to Mason's ranch, watched his boss with cold eyes. "Told you we should have checked the stories more careful. That wasn't just any lawman before he lost his sight. They called him Deadeye Mason for a reason." "I know the stories," Raven snapped. "Fastest gun in Wyoming territory. Man who could shoot a playing card edge on at 50 paces. But that was 15 years ago, before Outlaws took his eyes and killed his wife." "Stories ain't died, though," Snake observed. "Folks still talk about him winning shooting contests. Say he can hear a man's intention before they even draw." Raven stopped pacing. "He's one man, blind, living on a ranch that controls the valleys. Main water source." His voice turned calculating. "Without Mason's ranch, the others will fold. They're already scared. Thompson's ready to sell. The Miller place is one bad season from bankruptcy." "Boss," one of the scouts ventured, "maybe we should move on. Other valleys." "No!" Raven's fist slammed the table. "I promised our investors this valley. Every ranch, every water right, every head of cattle. Mason's just an obstacle, one that needs removing." Snake's expression didn't change. "Removing a blind man won't sit well with folks, especially not one respected like Mason." "Then we don't remove him directly." Raven's smile was cruel. "We squeeze him, break him, make him see," poor choice of words, "that he can't protect what's his anymore." Meanwhile, at the Mason ranch, Sarah watched her father working with his special targets. Years ago, he'd designed them himself, metal plates of different sizes, each making a distinctive tone when struck. The larger ones rang deep and low, the smaller ones high and clear. Now they were scattered across the back pasture, at varying distances. Mason stood with his Colt drawn, head tilted slightly. Sarah had seen this 1,000 times, but it still amazed her. His shots came in rapid succession. 6 rounds, 6 different tones, ringing out across the valley. "How many did I miss?" he asked, though he already knew. "None, Papa, but you already knew that." Mason nodded, reloading with practiced efficiency. His fingers knew every curve of the gun, every round of ammunition. "The Raven gang isn't just about buying land," he said. "They're building something bigger, an empire." Sarah helped him set up new targets. "Jake at the store says they've done this before. 3 other valleys. Once they get control of the water, they control everything." Mason's voice was grim. "Cattle can't live without water. Crops won't grow. They're not just taking land, they're taking lives, dreams. What do we do?" Mason's next 6 shots rang out before he answered. Perfect hits again. "We prepare. Get word to the neighbors we trust. Stock extra supplies." He paused. "And you practice like I showed you. These men, they're not just rustlers or bandits, they're worse. They hide behind business words and legal papers, but they're killers." A rider approached. They both heard it, but Mason relaxed slightly. "Thompson," he said, riding hard, scared. Minutes later, Bill Thompson's horse clattered into the yard. "Mason, Sarah, they burned my north pasture, killed 3 of my best bulls." Mason's hand found Sarah's shoulder. "It begins," he said softly. "Get Mr. Thompson some coffee, strong. Then we'll discuss how to stop these vultures before they tear." Thunder Valley apart. Sarah squeezed his hand before heading inside. She glanced back to see her father's face turned toward the distant ridges, listening to something only he could hear. Storm's coming, she thought. But they didn't know her father like she did. Didn't know that darkness had made him stronger, not weaker. The Raven Gang was about to learn that some legends never die. They just adapt, becoming something even more dangerous in the darkness. The attack came at midnight. Mason heard them before they reached the ranch, 12 men trying to move quietly through the darkness. Their whispered voices carried across the valley, clear as church bells to his trained ears. "Sarah," he called, softly. "It's time." His daughter was already moving, taking her position upstairs with the Winchester rifle. They'd practiced this, planned for it. The Raven Gang wasn't the first group to think a blind rancher made an easy target. Mason stood on his porch, listening. The attackers had split into 3 groups, 4 men approaching the barn, where they'd likely try to start a fire. Another, 4 circling toward the back of the house. The last 4, including one he recognized as Snake Harper by his distinctive spurs, coming straight on. "Make it look good, boys," Snake's voice carried. "Want this to seem like an accident." Mason's hands remained relaxed at his sides, though his guns were loose in their holsters. He'd changed into his old lawman's rig, 2 Colts instead of 1. In the dark, he thought grimly, we're all blind. The first explosion rocked the barn. They'd used dynamite. Amateur's mistake. The noise would carry for miles, alert every ranch in the valley, but they didn't care. They wanted witnesses to what happened to those who defied the Raven Gang. "Mr. Mason," Snake called out, "shame about your barn. Accidents happen when a blind man tries to run a ranch." Mason turned his head slightly, tracking the men trying to flank the house. Their boots crunched on gravel, heartbeats racing with anticipation of easy violence. They still thought they had the advantage. "Funny thing about accidents," Mason replied, letting them hear the smile in his voice. "They usually happen to folks who aren't paying attention." His first shot came before anyone realized he'd drawn. One of the flankers went down, howling, his gun hand shattered. The second shot caught another's weapon, sending it spinning into the darkness. "Jesus," Snake's voice cracked. "He can see. He's not blind." Mason was moving now, years of practice, guiding his steps. "No, Mr. Harper, just learn to see differently." More shots rang out. Sarah from upstairs, picking her targets with precision. 2 more men fell, clutching wounded legs. Mason had taught her well. Disable, don't kill. Dead men couldn't testify about who sent them. Snake and his remaining men opened fire, but they were shooting blind in the true darkness. Mason could hear their bullets whining past, striking wood and dirt, but he could also hear their positions, their movements, their fear. His Colts spoke again, a deadly duet. 2 more guns went flying, accompanied by screams of pain and disbelief. "How could a blind man shoot like this?" "Last chance, Mr. Harper," Mason called out. "Surrender now, explain to the sheriff who sent you, or find out why they used to call me Deadeye." The answer came in a fusillade of desperate shots. Mason sighed. They never learned. His guns thundered one final time, and Snake Harper's trademark spurs rang out as he hit the dirt, his shooting arm useless. Silence fell across the ranch yard, broken only by groans of pain and the crackling of the barn fire. Sarah appeared beside him, her rifle still ready. 8 wounded, Papa, 4 ran. Mason nodded. "They'll carry word back to Raven about how his accident turned out." He tilted his head, listening to the approaching hoofbeats. "Sheriff's coming. 3 riders. Thompson must have seen the fire." Sarah touched his arm. "This isn't over, is it?" "No, girl." Mason holstered his guns. "Raven won't stop. Now it's war." His face hardened in the firelight. But he'd just learned something important. "What's that?" "In the dark, a man's eyes don't matter. Only his aim, and mine's still perfect." Dawn painted Thunder Valley blood red as Sheriff Tom Burke surveyed the aftermath at Mason's ranch. 8 wounded men lay in his jail now, including the notorious Snake Harper. None would talk, but their expensive guns and ammunition told a story. "Never seen shooting like that, John," Burke said, watching Mason rebuild his barn door. Despite his blindness, Mason's hands worked with practiced efficiency. 8 men hit, everyone in the gun hand or shoulder, no killing shots. "Dead men don't." "Testify, Tom." Mason's fingers traced the wood grain, measuring the next nail's position. "And Raven's smart enough to hire men who won't talk while they're alive." Sarah approached with coffee, her rifle still slung across her back. She hadn't slept, wouldn't, until the barn was secured. 3 more families rode out this morning, she reported. The Millers, the Hendersons, and the Whitakers sold their land for pennies to Raven's men. Mason's hands stilled. "How many families left in the valley now?" 4, Burke answered. "Including you. Thompson's holding out, and the Wilsons. Old Jake at the store says he'll die before he sells, but he trailed off. But he's scared," Mason finished. "They all are. Raven's made his point. Any ranch that doesn't sell burns. Any family that resists gets hurt." A horse approached at a gallop. Mason's head turned slightly. "Thompson's boy," he said before the rider came into view. "Riding too hard. Something's wrong. Young Billy Thompson nearly fell from his horse. Mr. Mason, Sheriff, they killed our cattle, all of them. Poisoned the waterhole, too. Pa sent me to tell you. They're coming. Raven himself with 30 riders." Burke cursed. 30 men. That's an army, John. I've got 2 deputies. Even with you. "They'll be here by sundown," Mason said calmly, hammering another nail. "Raven's learned I can outshoot his men in the dark. He'll want daylight witnesses. Make an example of the blind man who defied him." Sarah's hand found her father's shoulder. "We could leave, Papa. Start fresh somewhere else." Mason shook his head. "This valley's been our home for 3 generations. Your mother's buried here, and if we run, Raven wins. He'll control all the water, and with it every ranch for 100. "Miles! Then we fight," Burke declared. "I'll wire the territorial marshal, gather every man who—" "No time," Mason interrupted. "And Raven's probably cut the telegraph lines already." His unseeing eyes turned toward the distant ridges. "But he's made a mistake. A big one." "What's that?" Billy asked. "He's coming in force in daylight, thinking it gives him the advantage." Mason smiled grimly. "But light or dark makes no difference to me, and now I know exactly when and where he's coming." He turned to Sarah. "Get my special ammunition from the cellar, the loads we worked up last winter, then help me set up the musical targets across the valley approaches." "The ones that ring different tones?" Burke asked. "Every tone marks a distance. Every distance marks a kill zone." Mason's voice carried the cold certainty of a man who'd spent 15 years preparing for this moment. "Raven thinks he's hunting a blind man. Instead, he's marching into a trap 15 years in the making." Sarah watched her father's face, seeing the lawman he'd once been emerging from behind the quiet rancher he'd become. "What do you need us to do?" "Spread the word to anyone still loyal. When the shooting starts, stay clear of the marked zones, and remember what I taught you about sound." He patted his Colts. "Tonight Thunder Valley earns its name, and James Raven learns why they still whisper about Deadeye Mason." In the distance, dust clouds marked the approach of riders. The shadow of war fell across Thunder Valley, and at its center stood a blind man who'd learned to see through darkness. The battle lines were drawn. By sunset, the valley would run red, either with the blood of good men or with the setting sun on Raven's retreat. The afternoon sun beat down on Thunder Valley as Mason guided Sarah's hands over the rifle barrel. "Feel the weight," he instructed. "The balance. A gun's like a man. It tells you its truth through touch, not sight." They stood in the back pasture, surrounded by Mason's musical targets. Each metal plate was precisely positioned. tuned to a specific note when struck. To Sarah, they were just targets. To Mason, they were a map of sound, marking every crucial approach to the ranch. "Close your eyes," Mason said. "Listen, what do you hear?" Sarah obeyed, concentrating like he'd taught her. Wind in the grass, cattle on the north ridge, a hawk circling overhead. Deeper. Listen to the spaces between sounds. She frowned. Then, horses, maybe 2 miles out, moving slow, trying to stay hidden. Mason smiled. "Raven scouts. They think they're being clever, staying out of sight, but they can't hide their sounds." He took the rifle, demonstrating a shot without firing. "When the time comes, don't shoot at what you see. Shoot at what you hear. Like you do? Losing. My sight taught me something important." Mason's fingers traced the rifle's action. "Eyes can deceive. They see what they expect to see. But sound tells the truth. A man's breath catches before he draws. His boot leather creaks when he shifts his weight to fire. His heart beats faster when he's about to kill." He handed the rifle back. "Your mother understood. She's the one who helped me develop this system after I lost my sight. Said if I couldn't see to shoot, I'd have to learn a new way." Sarah swallowed hard. They rarely spoke of her mother. "Tell me about that day, when the outlaws came." Mason was quiet for a long moment. His unseeing eyes turned toward the distant mountains. "Was escorting a gold shipment. Your mother insisted on coming. She loved to travel. We were ambushed in a narrow pass. I took down 6 of them, but the 7th..." His hand touched the scars around his eyes. "Used a shotgun loaded with rock. Salt! While I was blind, they shot Catherine." His voice hardened. "But even blind, I killed that last outlaw. Tracked him by sound, by the crunch of his boots, by his panicked breathing. That's when I learned a man doesn't need eyes to fight. He needs purpose." A target rang out. Sarah had fired without warning, hitting the farthest plate dead center. The clear tone echoed across the valley. "Good," Mason nodded. "Now do it with your eyes closed." They practiced until the sun began to set, Sarah learning to trust her ears more than her eyes. Mason taught her how different surfaces affected sound, how to judge distance by echo, how to predict a man's movement by the rhythm of his steps. "Ravens. Men will come in thinking they have every advantage," Mason explained as they cleaned their weapons. "They'll have numbers, they'll have daylight, but they'll be walking into a valley that sings to us, that tells us their every move." "Like now?" Sarah asked quietly. Mason tilted his head. "You hear them too? 3 riders just crested the east ridge, moving slow, watching us." He smiled. "Let them watch. Let them think they're learning our secrets. They see an old blind man teaching his daughter to shoot. They don't understand he's teaching her to listen." Sarah chambered around. "Should we show them how well I learn?" "No." Mason's hand covered hers. "Let them go. Every report they take back to Raven will make him more confident, more certain of victory. And when the time comes..." He patted the Colt at his hip. "The valley will sing a different tune, one written in lead and gunpowder." As darkness fell, the distant riders withdrew, but Mason and Sarah kept practicing, their shots guided now by sound alone. In the growing night, Sarah finally understood. Her father hadn't adapted to blindness, he'd transcended it. He'd turned his greatest weakness into a strength no one else could match. "Remember," Mason said as they headed inside, "tomorrow's battle won't be won by who sees best. It'll be won by who listens, who understands that every shot is a note in the valley's song." Sarah looked at her father, this legend who'd turned darkness into power, and knew Raven's men had no idea what they were riding into. "I understand, Papa. I hear the song." Thunder Valley's general store had become a war council. Old Jake Wilson stood behind his counter, shotgun in easy reach, while the valley's remaining loyal ranchers gathered around Mason. Though he couldn't see them, Mason could hear the fear in their breathing, the way their boots shuffled nervously on the wooden floor. "Raven's men are buying up ammunition," Jake reported. "Cleaned out every store in 3 counties. They're planning something big." "Let them." Mason's fingers traced the store's counter, measuring distances, memorizing the layout. "Every bullet they buy is one more they'll waste shooting at shadows." Bill Thompson slammed his fist down. "Damn it, Mason, this isn't one of your shooting contests. Raven's got 30 killers coming. They burned my pasture, poisoned my water. What chance do we have?" Mason turned toward Thompson's voice. "Tell me something, Bill. That north pasture of yours, the one they burned, how many gullies run through it?" 3. "Why?" "And those gullies they channel sound like a trumpet, don't they? A man shooting from the rim sounds like he's everywhere at once." Understanding dawned in Thompson's voice. "You're not planning to fight them head-on. A blind man learns to use what others overlook." Mason smiled slightly. "This valley's been my eyes for 15 years. Every cave, every canyon, every place where sound plays tricks. While Raven's men were watching me, I was listening to them, learning their patterns, their habits." Sarah entered the store, bringing the smell of rain with her. "Storm's coming, Papa. Big one by the feel of the wind." Mason nodded. "Good. Rain changes how sound travels, makes men sloppy, nervous, makes them bunch together instead of spreading out." His hand found his gun. "How many of you will stand with us?" The silence was heavy. These were ranchers, not gunfighters. They had families to protect. "I'm with you," Jake said firmly. "This store's been in my family 40 years. I'll die before I let Raven take it." "The Wilson boys are in," came another voice. "Pa always said we owed you for saving our ranch during the drought." One by one they committed. Not many, perhaps a dozen men in total. But Mason heard the steel entering their voices, replacing fear with determination. Good. Mason laid out his plan, using items from Jake's counter to create a map others could see. "Thompson, your burned pasture becomes our first trap. Those gullies will make 10 men sound like 50. Jake, your store's central. We'll make it look weakly defended, draw them in." "What about the ranch?" Sarah asked. "That's where they'll expect me to make my stand." "Pride, they'll think. The blind man defending his home." Mason's smile was cold. "Instead, they'll find an empty house and a valley that fights back." He turned to the gathered men. "Raven's counting on daylight, numbers, and fear, but this valley belongs to us. Every echo, every shadow, every trick of sound that's guided me for 15 years. It's all part of the trap." "And if it doesn't work?" Thompson asked quietly. "Then we die standing, not running." Mason's voice carried the weight of his years as a lawman. "But Raven made a mistake. He thinks he's hunting a blind man. Instead, he's walking into a blind man's world." Thunder rolled across the valley, matching Mason's words. The storm was almost upon them. "Sarah, help me set up the musical targets along the approaches. The rain will change their tones. We need to learn the new notes before Raven arrives." He turned to the others. "The rest of you go home. Kiss your families. Get some rest. Tomorrow, we teach Raven why this place is called Thunder Valley." As the men dispersed, Jake approached Mason. "John, Catherine would be proud. Seeing you stand like this." Mason's hand tightened on his walking stick. "She's why I have to stand, Jake. This valley, it's not just land. It's where she lived, where she died, where she taught me that losing. My sight didn't mean losing my strength." The first raindrops hit the store's roof, creating a rhythm Mason knew would last through the night. Perfect, he thought. By morning, every approach would be mud, slowing Raven's men. Every gunshot would echo differently, confusing their aim. The storm had come to Thunder Valley. By tomorrow night, they'd know which storm was deadlier, the one in the sky or the one Raven had awakened in a blind man's heart. Rain drummed on Thunder Valley through the night, But Mason didn't sleep. He stood in the barn, surrounded by the tools of his trade. Not ranch tools, but the specialized equipment he'd developed over 15 years of shooting blind. "These shells are different," he explained to Sarah, opening a wooden case. "Each one packed special, different powder loads, different sounds when they fire. In the chaos of battle, the report of my gun becomes another way to signal our people." His fingers traced the rows of ammunition. 3 grains extra powder sounds like thunder. That's the signal to fall back. Light load whispers like a whisper. Means advance. He smiled slightly. "Took your mother and me 2 years to perfect these loads." Sarah watched him work, realizing how long he must have planned for this moment. "You always knew something like this would come, didn't you? A blind man with a reputation for never missing. Course they'd come eventually." Mason moved to a workbench, where more of his special equipment lay. "That's why I had your mother help me set up the valley's defenses before she died. Every fence post, every water trough, every structure, they're all placed to channel sound." He picked up what looked like a simple piece of pipe. "This fits under the porch. When the wind blows through it, sounds like men whispering. Place enough of them, and Raven's boys won't know which sounds are real and which aren't." A horse approached outside. Mason cocked his head. Sheriff Burke, riding double from the sound. Someone's hurt. Moments later, Burke burst in supporting a bloodied Jake Wilson. "Raven's advance scouts," the sheriff explained, "tried to burn Jake's store. He fought them off, but—" "Got 2 of the bastards," Jake wheezed, "but they got word back to Raven. They know about the gullies, about your sound tricks." "Someone talked." Mason's face hardened. "Thompson's boy, had to be. Saw him riding east earlier, moving too fast for an honest purpose." His hands never stopped working, loading cartridges. "Doesn't matter. Knowing about a trap isn't the same as knowing how to avoid it, John," Burke said quietly. "Maybe it's time to evacuate. Get the women and children out while—" "No." Mason's voice cracked like a whip. "The moment we start running, Raven wins. This ends here." He moved to the barn door, head tilted. "Listen. Really listen." They fell silent. The rain had softened to a gentle patter, and in its rhythm, other sounds emerged, the creek swollen with runoff, wind moaning through the valley's rock formations. The subtle shifting of weathered wood. "This valley's been singing to me for 15 years, Mason said, "teaching me its secrets. Now it's time to make it sing for Raven." He turned to Sarah. "Get the musical targets set along the creek bed. The waters rise will change their tones, give us a natural warning system." To Burke, "Take Jake to the root cellar. It's stocked with medical supplies. Then get your deputies into position along the ridgeline. Remember, fire only when you hear my signal shots." "And what about you?" Sarah asked. Mason checked his Colts one final time. "I'm going to give Raven's scouts something to report. Let them see the blind man practicing his tricks." He smiled coldly. "But they won't see everything. Some secrets you save for when they matter most." As if to punctuate his words, thunder rolled across the valley. But this wasn't natural thunder. It was the sound of hoofbeats, many hoofbeats. "They're coming," Mason said quietly. "Earlier than expected. Raven spooked. He's not thinking clearly." He could hear the approaching army, at least 30 riders trying to move quietly through the rain-soaked valley. Sarah raised her rifle, but Mason shook his head. "Not yet. Let them come. Let them think they understand what they're facing." His unseeing eyes turned toward the sound of the approaching force. "They see a blind man's weakness. Time to show them a blind man's strength." The storm was passing, but a different kind of thunder was about to break over the valley. Mason stood in his barn door, listening to death approach, and smiled. Everything he'd prepared for 15 years was about to be tested. By sunset, Thunder Valley would have a new legend, not about how a lawman lost his sight, but about how a blind man brought justice to those who thought him helpless. "Remember," he told Sarah softly, "in the darkness, we're all blind. The only difference is, I've learned to live there. They haven't." James Raven led his men through the rain-soaked valley, 30 hardened killers spread out in a careful formation. The morning sun was just breaking through the clouds, revealing Thunder Valley in all its treacherous glory. Every shadow could hide a defender. Every rock could mask a rifle barrel. "Movement at Mason's ranch," one of his scouts reported. "The blind man's on his porch, just sitting there, like he's waiting for us." Raven raised his field glasses. Sure enough, John Mason sat in his rocking chair, a rifle across his lap, seemingly unaware of the small army approaching his land. The very picture of a helpless old man. "Awful confident for someone about to die," Snake Harper muttered, his wounded arm still in a sling from their last encounter. "He's putting on a show," Raven replied. "Thompson's boy told us all about his tricks, the musical targets, the sound traps. The old man's been playing us, making himself seem more dangerous than he is." A shot cracked across the valley. One of Raven's men cursed as his hat flew off, a neat hole punched through its crown. Mason's voice carried clearly in the morning air. "That's close enough, Mr. Raven. Next one won't be a warning." But Raven smiled. The shot had revealed something crucial. Mason was good, incredibly good, but he could only shoot at what he could hear, and Raven had planned for that. "First wave," he commanded, "nice and quiet, just like we practiced." 10 men dismounted, spreading out on foot. They moved with exaggerated care, stepping softly on the wet ground, their boots wrapped in cloth to muffle their steps. Mason remained motionless on his porch, head tilted slightly as if listening. The first wave was halfway to the ranch house when one of Mason's musical targets rang out, a deep, resonant tone that echoed across the valley. Then another, higher pitched. Then a third. "He's tracking us," one of the men shouted. "How the hell?" More shots rang out, but not from Mason. Hidden defenders opened fire from the ridgelines, catching Raven's men in a deadly crossfire, the cloth-wrapped boots that had masked. Their approach now made it impossible to run without slipping in the mud. "Pull back," Raven ordered. "Second wave, provide covering fire." But as his men retreated, something strange happened. Voices seemed to come from everywhere, whispers, footsteps, the sound of rifles being cocked. His men fired at shadows, at echoes, at ghosts that existed only in sound. "Boss," Snake called out, "the valley, it's like it's alive. Every shot echoes wrong, every sound's a trick." Raven watched in growing fury as his careful plan unraveled. Mason hadn't moved from his porch, hadn't fired a shot since his warning, but somehow he was controlling the battlefield, turning the very valley against them. "Sir!" Another scout rode up. "Thompson's place is crawling with armed men." "We can hear them moving, talking." "The store, too," called another. "Must be 20 rifles at least." But Raven had spoken to Thompson's boy. He knew the truth. There couldn't be more than a dozen defenders in the entire valley, which meant sound tricks, he growled. "All of it. The blind man's turned the whole valley into one big trap. Making. 10 men sound like 50. He turned to Snake. "Take 10 men around the back. The boy told us about the hidden trails. We'll catch the old man in his own game." But as Snake's group began to move out, more musical targets rang, different tones, this time forming an eerie melody that echoed from the rocks. Immediately, the hidden defenders shifted position, moving to counter the flanking attempt before it began. "Impossible," Snake spat. "He's using those damn targets to signal his people. Every tone means something." Raven's rage built as he watched. His assault stall, 30 professional killers, held at bay by a blind man and a handful of ranchers. All because Mason had turned sound itself into a weapon. "Enough games," he snarled. "Burn it all, the ranch, the store, every building in the valley, smoke them out." But even as his men prepared the fire arrows, Mason's voice carried. "To them, calm and deadly as ever. That would be a mistake, Mr. Raven. Fire makes sound too. And I've had 15 years to learn exactly how burning buildings echo in this valley." As if to prove his point, a single shot rang out. One of Raven's men screamed, his torch flying from his shattered hand. Mason hadn't moved from his chair, but somehow he'd known exactly where the threat would come from. "Last chance," Mason called out. "Leave my valley, or learn why they used to call me Deadeye." Raven's response was a roar of rage and a single word: "Kill him!" The real battle for Thunder Valley was about to begin. Thunder Valley earned its name that day. The crash of gunfire echoed off the rocky walls as Raven's men charged the ranch, their initial caution forgotten in a rage of frustration. But Mason had spent 15 years preparing for this moment, and every shot they fired played into his hands. "Papa!" Sarah's voice cut through the chaos. 10 men moving through the north gully." Mason nodded, already tracking them by sound. Their boots splashed through the rain-soaked ground, telling him exactly where they were. His Colt spoke in rapid succession. 6 shots, 6 men dropping with shattered weapons or wounded arms. "South side's clear," Burke called from his position. "That trick with the windpipes is working. They're shooting at nothing." Mason's trap was springing perfectly. The pipes he'd hidden throughout the valley caught the wind, creating phantom sounds of movement, whispered conversations, boots on gravel. Raven's men were fighting shadows, while the real defenders struck from carefully prepared positions. "They're splitting up," Mason said, tracking the sounds of Raven's force dividing. "Just like we planned. Sarah?" His daughter's rifle cracked from the barn loft. A musical target rang out, high tone followed by low. Immediately, the hidden defenders shifted positions, using routes they'd practiced until they could run them. "Blindfolded. Boss, this is madness." Snake Harper's voice carried clearly. "We can't fight what we can't see." "Everyone can see," Raven screamed. "He's the blind one. Just rush him." 5 men charged the porch where Mason sat. He smiled slightly, hearing their approach. Their boots told him everything. Weight distribution, speed, even which hands held their guns. His Colts emerged faster than sight could follow. The first man went down clutching his gun hand. The second spun as his shoulder took the hit. The third and fourth lost their weapons to precisely placed shots. The fifth skidded to a stop, realizing too late that he was charging a legend. "Now you understand," Mason said calmly. "You thought blindness was my weakness, but in this valley, sound is all that matters." A shot whistled past his head, Raven himself firing from behind a water trough, but the bullet's passage told Mason exactly where he was. His return shot splintered the trough inches from Raven's face. "That's one," Mason called out. "Would you like to try for 2? More musical targets rang out, Sarah signaling that Thompson and his men had engaged the flanking force trying to circle behind the ranch. The valley filled with a symphony of battle, gunfire, shouts, the unique tones of Mason's targets, all combining into a tactical map only he could read. "Raven's men are falling back," Burke reported, regrouping near the creek. Mason nodded. "They're learning, but too late." He turned his head slightly. "Sarah, give them something to think about, like we practiced." Sarah's rifle spoke 3 times. 3 different targets rang out in quick succession, creating a cascading echo that sounded like an entire company of men advancing. Raven's forces broke formation, shooting wildly at the phantom attack. "Devil, take this valley!" One of them screamed. "Every shadow's a shooter, every sound's a lie." "Hold fast," Raven commanded, but his voice had lost its authority. "The blind man can't—" Mason's shot cut him off, punching through his hat. "Can't what, Mr. Raven? Can't see you? Don't need to. Your voice, your movements, even your fear, they all make sound. And in Thunder Valley, sound is my domain." As if nature itself sided with Mason, real thunder rolled across the sky. The morning sun vanished behind storm clouds, plunging the valley into a twilight gloom that made sight even less reliable. "Fall back!" Snake Harper yelled. "Fall back to the ridge!" But Mason wasn't done. His specially loaded cartridges sang out different tones as he fired, signaling his defenders to cut off the retreat. Every route Raven's men tried was already covered. every escape already anticipated. 15 years, Mason said, his voice carrying. Across the battlefield, 15 years I've prepared this valley. Every rock, every gully, every echo, they're all part of my eyes now. You came hunting a blind man. Instead, you walked into my vision of hell. The storm broke overhead, rain pouring down. But Mason just smiled, knowing how the rain would change the sound patterns, creating new advantages only he could exploit. The battle for Thunder Valley was reaching its crescendo, and only one man truly knew how to conduct this deadly symphony. Time to show them the rest of our tricks, he told Sarah. Ring the devil's bells. The storm raged over Thunder Valley, but inside Mason's ranch house, a different kind of storm was brewing. Sarah tended to her father's grazing wound. A lucky shot from one of Raven's men had caught his shoulder. As she worked, Mason's head tilted suddenly, catching a sound too faint for others to hear. Someone's in the barn, he said quietly. Moving careful, trying not to make noise. One of Raven's men. Sarah reached for her rifle. No. Mason's face hardened. I know those footsteps. Haven't heard them in 15 years, but a man doesn't forget the walk of someone who destroyed his life. Before Sarah could respond, a voice called from the barn doorway. Not Raven's usual commanding tone, but something softer, almost regretful. Hello, John. Been a long time. Mason stood, ignoring his wound. Marcus Raven, or should I say, Marshal Marcus Reed. Sarah's breath caught. The name meant nothing to her, but she saw how it changed her father's stance, how his hands trembled slightly before steadying on his guns. You remember? Raven, or Reed, stepped into the house. He moved differently now, more like the lawman he'd once been than the ruthless gang leader he'd become. Thought that shotgun blast might have taken more than just your sight. I remember. Everything, Mason said coldly. Every sound, every shot, every scream, including Catherine's. Sarah's mind raced. Catherine, her mother. But that would mean, your mother, girl, Raven said, reading her expression, died because of a choice your father made. A choice we both made, if I'm being honest. The gold shipment. Mason's voice was deadly quiet. Tell her, Marcus. Tell my daughter how her mother really died. Raven sighed, settling into a chair uninvited. His guns remained holstered, a gesture of trust, or perhaps merely confidence. 15 years ago, your father and I were marshals together, partners, the best in the territory. We were escorting a gold shipment, 200,000 in army payroll, and you decided it was worth more than your badge, Mason finished. We both did, John, or have you forgotten? Raven's voice hardened. We planned it together, the fake ambush, the missing gold, everything, but you changed your mind at the last minute, got noble. Sarah stared at her father, seeing him differently. Papa? I changed my mind because Catherine found out, Mason said. Came to stop us, to save us from ourselves. And you... His hands clenched. You panicked, shot wild. The salt from your shotgun took my eyes, but your second shot... It wasn't meant for her. For the first time, real regret colored Raven's voice. She stepped in front of you, trying to stop me from finishing what you'd started. I've regretted that day for 15 years. Regretted it so much, you became exactly what we once hunted. Mason's laugh was bitter. The great Marshal Reed now, just another murdering land grabber. And you became the noble blind rancher, Raven countered, living off your reputation, pretending you were never tempted by that gold. Tell me, John, did you ever tell Catherine's family what really happened? How their daughter died because her husband planned to steal from the army? Mason moved with devastating speed. His gun cleared leather before Raven could blink, the barrel pressing against the former marshal's chest. I confessed everything, he said quietly. to Catherine's father, to the army, to God. Then I took my punishment, lived 15 years, in darkness, trying to make up for one moment of weakness. While I took a different path, Raven acknowledged, used that gold to build something, an empire, built on blood and bullied ranchers. Built on the truth about men, Raven corrected, that everyone has their price, everyone breaks, even the great John Mason was willing to steal once upon a time. Sarah's voice shook. The other marshal, in the stories you told me, the one who died in the ambush. I let them believe that. Raven nodded. Easier than admitting Marshal Reed had turned outlaw, changed my name, built my reputation from scratch, but I never forgot my old partner. The man who could outshoot anyone in the territory, even blind. Is that why you came here? Mason's gun didn't waver. To remind me of my sins. I came to offer you a chance. One last chance. Raven leaned forward despite the gun at his chest. Join me, John. Your skills, my organization, we could own this whole territory. The gold's still out there, you know, hidden where we planned to hide it. Enough to make kings of us both. For a long moment silence filled the room. Sarah watched her father's face, seeing the weight of old guilt, old temptation. You're right about one thing, Marcus, Mason said finally. Everyone has their price, everyone breaks, but some of us learn from it, grow stronger in the broken places. His finger tightened on the trigger. Catherine taught me that, with her last breath. Then I suppose this ends the way it was always going to, Raven sighed. One of us dead, the other carrying more guilt. His hand dropped casually to his side. But you forgot something, partner. I know all your tricks, including... His hand swept up, hurling a handful of loose cartridges across the room. The sound of bouncing brass covered the whisper of his draw, but Mason was already moving. His first shot took Raven's gun, his second caught the former marshal's shoulder, a mirror of the wound that had started their conversation. You forgot. Something too, Mason said as Raven clutched his bleeding arm. I don't need tricks anymore. Catherine's death taught me to see truth without eyes. And the truth is, you're still the same coward who shot wild in a panic 15 years ago. Outside, the battle still raged. But inside Mason's house, an older battle was reaching its end. Two former partners, each changed by one moment of weakness, facing the consequences of choices made in younger, darker days. Finish it then, Raven growled. Prove you're better than me. Mason's gun didn't waver. No, you'll face justice, real justice, for everything. The gold, Catherine, every ranch you've stolen. Every life you've ruined, trying to build your empire on blood. Sarah moved to bind Raven's hands, but her father's next words stopped her cold. Besides, Mason said quietly, Catherine would want her daughter to see that vengeance isn't justice. And I've spent 15 years learning to see things her way. Thunder Valley echoed with gunfire as Snake Harper rallied Raven's remaining men. They'd taken cover behind the ridgeline, still 20 strong, unaware their leader was now Mason's prisoner. Inside the ranch house, Mason stood perfectly still, listening to the battle while Sarah tied Raven securely to a chair. Your men won't surrender just because you're captured, Mason said, tracking the sound of movement outside. Snake Harper's wanted in 3 territories. He knows there's no going back. Raven tested his bonds, the old marshal's training showing, in how he probed for weaknesses. Harper's not just a killer, John. He's ambitious. The moment he realizes I'm caught, he'll try to take over, turn my organization into something worse. Then we end this, now. Mason turned toward Sarah's footsteps. Get word to Burke and Thompson. Tell them to fall back to the secondary positions, the ones we prepared for the final act. As Sarah slipped out, Raven laughed softly. Still playing. Chess 5 moves ahead, aren't you, John? Just like when we were marshals. What's your play this time? You're going to help me finish this. Mason's unseeing eyes fixed on his former partner. Your men need to hear from you, need to understand exactly what they're fighting for and against. And why would I help you? Because deep down, under 15 years of greed and murder, there's still a piece of Marshall Reed in there, the man who once cared about justice. Mason's voice softened, the man who still feels guilty about Catherine. Raven was silent for a long moment. Outside, the gunfire intensified as Harper's men probed the ranch's defenses. Even if I help you, Harper won't back down. He's gotten a taste of power, and he knows your reputation. Taking you down would make him a legend. I'm counting on that. Mason moved to the window, head tilted to track the battle by sound. Snake Harper's worst weakness is his pride, his need to prove himself better than other killers. A cold smile touched his lips. Time he learned what a real killer sounds like. He turned back to Raven. Your choice, Marcus. Help me end this clean, or watch Harper destroy everything you built. Turn your empire of greed into an empire of slaughter. Before Raven could respond, Sarah's voice carried from outside, the special whistle that meant urgent news. Mason's head snapped up, catching something in the sound patterns that made him curse. Harper's men found the back trail, he said. The one only you and Thompson's boy knew about. They're trying to flank us. Raven shifted in his chair. John, Harper knows things. About that day 15 years ago. Things I never told anyone else. Mason went very still. What kind of things? Where the gold is hidden. Who else was involved? If he takes over, those secrets come out. Everyone learns how the great John Mason once planned to steal from the army, how his noble sacrifice was really just a last-minute attack of conscience. You think I care about that now? Mason's voice was deadly quiet. Catherine's been dead 15 years. My sight's been gone just as long. Let them know the truth. Even if it destroys your daughter's faith in you? Mason's hands tightened on his guns. Sarah knows who I am, who I was, and who I chose to become. He moved to the door. Last chance, Marcus. Help me end this, or I'll end it my way. And trust me, you won't like my way. Through the window came Snake Harper's voice, calling out to his men. The blind man's trapped. Burn him out. Burn it all. Mason smiled grimly. They never learn. Fire makes sound, too. More sound than anything else in the valley. He checked his guns one final time. Time to choose, Marcus. Marshal or murderer. Because once I step outside, there's no middle ground left. Raven stared at his former partner for a long moment. Then something shifted in his face, perhaps a glimpse of the lawman he'd once been. Harper keeps a stick of dynamite in his saddlebags, he said quietly. Likes to use it for dramatic effect. If you can hear the fuse, Mason nodded. I can hear a rattlesnake's scales in the dark. A dynamite fuse might as well be thunder. He paused at the door. Any other secrets I should know? Just one. Raven's voice carried the weight of 15 years of guilt. I never meant to kill her, John, but every man I've killed since, those were choices, conscious choices. I know. Mason stepped out into the storm of battle. That's why you're in that chair and I'm out here. Some men learn from their sins. Others just keep repeating them. Thunder Valley was about to learn which kind of man John Mason had become. Dusk settled over Thunder Valley, bringing an uneasy quiet. Snake Harper's men had withdrawn to regroup, leaving Mason time to set his final pieces in place. In the ranch house, he stood before the fireplace, one hand resting on the mantel where his wife's picture sat. Catherine would be proud of you, Raven said from his chair. The way you've protected this valley, the way you raised your daughter. Don't speak her name. Mason's voice was soft, but carried an edge sharp as a razor. You lost that right 15 years ago, Sarah entered, her boots silent on the floorboards, a skill her father had taught her. Papa, Burke reports Harper's men are gathering at the North Ridge. Thompson counted 23 riders, and the special preparations. All in place, every musical target reset for night sounds. The windpipes are positioned just like you wanted. She hesitated. But Papa, if they all attack at once... Mason turned from the fireplace, his unseeing eyes somehow finding her location perfectly. Come here, girl. When she approached, he reached out, his calloused hands finding her face with gentle precision. Your mother died trying to save me from my own weakness, trying to show me there was more to life than reputation and reward. His voice grew thick. Everything I've done since, learning to shoot blind, preparing this valley, raising you right, it's been about proving her right. John, Raven interrupted, Harper won't wait much longer. He's got my men believing you killed me. They'll come with fire and dynamite, try to burn you out. Let them come. Mason's hands dropped to his guns. Fire makes sound. Dynamite makes more. And I've spent 15 years learning every echo in this valley. He turned to Sarah. You remember what I taught you about night shooting? She nodded, then caught herself. Yes. Don't trust your eyes. Trust your ears. The night belongs to those who listen. Good girl. Now check on our guests. Make sure Jake and Thompson are ready for their part. When Sarah had gone, Raven spoke. Again, she's just like her mother, same steel under the softness. One more word about Catherine, Mason said quietly, and I'll show you exactly how good I've gotten at shooting blind. But Raven pressed on. You need to tell her the whole truth, John, about the gold, about what really happened that day. Before, Harper does. Mason was silent for a long moment, listening to the distant sounds of Harper's men preparing for their attack. She knows enough, knows I was weak once, that I failed her mother, knows I've spent 15 years trying to make it right. And the gold. 200,000 in army payroll, still hidden where we plan to hide it. Let it rot. Mason checked, his ammunition one final time. Some treasures cost too much. A horse approached outside, one of Billy Thompson's brothers riding hard. Mr. Mason, Harper's men, they're stringing coal oil barrels along the ridge. Gonna roll them down, set the whole valley on fire. Mason nodded, unsurprised. Just like I thought, Harper's not subtle, likes his violence big and bright. He moved to the door. Time to show him why that's a mistake. John, Raven called out, something urgent in his voice. Harper knows things I never told anyone about that day, about the gold. He'll use them. Let him. Mason paused in the doorway. Truth's like sound, Marcus. Can't hide from it forever. Can only learn to face it. His head tilted, catching distant sounds of preparation. Sarah, time to ring the devil's bells. The musical targets began to sing, different tones for different positions, creating a symphony of tactical signals that only Mason's defenders understood. In the growing darkness, Thunder Valley prepared for its final battle. You really think you can beat 23 killers? Raven asked. Blind or not, those are hard odds. Mason's smile was cold as winter steel. In the dark, we're all blind. Difference is, I've learned to live here. They haven't. He checked his guns one final time. Tonight, Thunder Valley teaches them why a blind man's world is more dangerous than any they've known. The sun slipped behind the mountains, plunging the valley into darkness. But for John Mason, the darkness had never been clearer. Every sound, every echo, every whisper of wind through his carefully placed traps, they all sang to him, painting a picture more precise than any eyes could see. Time to finish what started 15 years ago, he said softly. Time to show them what a blind man sees when justice needs dealing. The night exploded in fire as Harper's men rolled the burning oil barrels down the ridge. Mason stood on his porch, listening to the approaching inferno, timing each barrel's descent by sound alone. The valley filled with an unholy orchestra, crackling flames, shouting men, and the deep rumble of the barrels. Now, he said quietly, Sarah's rifle cracked from her hidden position. The first barrel exploded halfway down the slope, sending burning oil spraying back toward Harper's men. More shots followed, the defenders picking their targets with surgical precision, just as Mason had taught them. "The blind man's ready for us," someone shouted. "He knew we'd try the fire." "Because fire makes sound," Mason called out, his voice carrying clearly. "Like the sound of your men trying to circle behind while we're distracted by the flames." His Colts roared in demonstration, and two of Harper's flankers cried out as their guns went flying. The night filled with curses as the outlaws realized their stealthy approach had been anything but. "Damn you, Mason," Harper's voice carried from the ridge. "Your tricks won't save you this time. Light the dynamite." Mason smiled coldly. Sarah, 3. Musical targets rang out in quick succession, high, low, middle. Thompson and his men opened fire from prepared positions, targeting the areas Mason had marked earlier. The dynamite never got lit. "You're fighting blind, Harper," Mason taunted. "But I've been blind longer. Every sound you make, every move you try, I've already heard it coming." More barrels crashed down the slope, but Mason's defenders were ready. Each explosion was met with precise counterfire, turning the outlaws' own attack against them. The valley became a maze of flame and shadow, but Mason moved through it like a ghost, guided by sound alone. "He's everywhere," one of Harper's men screamed. "How can he be everywhere?" "Because this valley belongs to him." Sarah's voice rang out as she picked off another attacker. "Every echo, every shadow, they're all his eyes now." Harper's response was a roar of rage and a volley of wild shots, but Mason had already moved, tracking the gang leader's position by sound. The musical targets sang out again, and the defenders shifted positions in perfect coordination. "Your men are breaking, Snake," Mason called. "They've figured out what you haven't, that you led them into a trap 15 years in the making." 15 years? Harper's voice cracked with sudden understanding. "Wait, you and Raven, the army payroll." "That's right." Mason's guns spoke again, dropping two more outlaws who tried to rush his position. "Your boss and I have history. Want to hear about it? About how Marshall Reed became James Raven? About how a blind man learned to see through darkness?" The battle paused as Harper absorbed this revelation. Mason could hear the outlaw leader's breathing change, his confidence cracking. "Boss?" one of Harper's men called uncertainly. "What's he talking about?" "Shut up and kill him," Harper screamed, but the authority had left his voice. His men were hesitating, realizing they'd been fed lies. Mason moved like a shadow through his burning valley, every step precise despite the chaos. His guns never missed, years of practice letting him place shots perfectly by sound alone. One by one, Harper's men fell or fled, their morale broken by the impossible accuracy of a blind man's bullets. "Your whole gang's built on lies, Snake." Mason's voice seemed to come from everywhere at once, the valley's acoustics amplifying his words. "Raven's lies, your lies, but the truth sounds different. Want to hear it?" A dynamite fuse sizzled, Harper's desperate gambit, but Mason had been waiting for this. His shots snuffed the fuse, then two more bullets destroyed Harper's gun and gun hand in rapid succession. "That's what truth sounds like," Mason said coldly as Harper screamed in pain. Like justice delivered in the dark, the remaining outlaws broken ran, their nerves shattered by the sight of their unbeatable leader brought down by a blind man's aim. But Mason wasn't finished. His musical targets sang out one final melody, and his defenders emerged from their positions, cutting off every escape route. "It's over, Snake," Mason said, approaching the wounded outlaw. "Your men are gone. Your boss is captured, and you just learned why they used to call me Deadeye." Harper spat blood. "Kill me then. Prove you're the better killer." "No." Mason's guns remained steady. "Killing's easy in the dark. Justice, that takes a clearer vision, the kind I found when I lost my sight." He turned his head slightly. "Sarah, signal Burke. Tell him we've got some prisoners for his jail." Thunder. Valley fell quiet, except for the crackling of dying fires. The battle was won, but Mason kept his guns ready. He could hear something in the wind, a whisper of approaching danger. Snake Harper had one last card to play, and the night wasn't over. Yet, Snake Harper waited until Mason's defenders were distracted with the prisoners. His good hand found the hidden derringer in his boot, the one he'd saved for moments just like this. The tiny gun made almost no sound as he drew it, but almost wasn't good enough. Mason's head snapped toward the whisper of metal on leather. "Sarah, down!" the derringer roared as Sarah dropped. Mason's return shot was instantaneous, guided by the flash and thunder of Harper's weapon. The outlaw's last gun went spinning away, along with two of his fingers. "You think I can't hear a derringer?" Mason's voice was cold. "I can hear a rattler's scales in the dark. Your breathing, your movements, they all betray you." But Harper laughed, a sound filled with vicious triumph. "Hear this then, Deadeye. While you were busy playing legend, I sent men to where Raven hid that army gold. All that time you spent guarding this worthless valley when the real prize was just waiting to be found." Mason went very still. In the ranch house, they could hear Raven straining against his bonds. "The cave in the high canyon," Harper continued. "The one you and Raven picked 15 years ago. My boys are there now, digging up your past. By sunrise, everyone will know how the great John Mason planned to steal from the army. How his dead wife wasn't just an innocent victim, but Mason's gun cracked again, silencing Harper with a shot that took off his hat brim. "You're right about one thing," Mason said quietly. "I did choose this valley over that gold. Chose to protect something real instead of chasing ghost stories." His unseeing eyes seemed to fix directly on Harper. "But you made one mistake in your calculations." "Yeah?" Harper spat. "What's that?" "I moved the gold. The night Catherine died. Buried it somewhere only a blind man could find." Mason's smile was grim. "Want to know where? Listen close. The sound of your breathing tells me you're very interested." He leaned in, voice dropping to a whisper. Harper's eyes widened as Mason spoke words only he could hear. Then the outlaw's face twisted in rage. "You're lying. It can't be. Test me." Mason stepped back. "You've got one gun left, the pocket pistol in your vest. Draw it. Try to make me tell you where 200,000 in gold really is. Or you can surrender, face justice, and live with never knowing." Sarah's rifle trained on Harper as the outlaw's hand inched toward his vest. The night held its breath, waiting for his choice. "Even if I don't draw," Harper snarled, "I'll tell everyone about you and Raven, about how you were going to steal that payroll, your reputation." "My reputation," Mason laughed softly. "I'm a blind man who just defeated 23 killers in the dark. You really think anyone will believe your stories over my legend?" "They'll believe this!" Harper's hand flashed for his vest. Mason's gun roared one final time. The pocket pistol flew from Harper's grip before he could even touch it, along with the entire pocket of his vest. "That's the thing about reputation," Mason said as Harper clutched his bleeding chest. "A man who can outshoot gangs while blind. Well, folks tend to believe his version of events." He turned toward the ranch house. "Isn't that right, Marshal Reed?" Raven's voice carried clearly. Everything Harper said was a lie. Mason was never part of the theft. He's the one who stopped me at the cost of his sight and his wife's life. I've got 15 years of guilt to prove it. Sarah moved to her father's side as Burke and his deputies took Harper into custody. "The gold, Papa. Did you really move it?" Mason holstered his guns. "Some treasures are worth more than gold, girl. Your mother taught me that." He smiled slightly. "And some secrets are best kept in the dark, where only a blind man can find them." As dawn broke over Thunder Valley, the last echoes of gunfire faded away. Mason stood on his porch, listening to the sounds of justice being done, deputies leading prisoners away, neighbors helping neighbors rebuild, the musical target singing softly in the morning breeze. "You know," Sarah said softly, "some folks will still wonder about you and Raven, about the gold. Let them wonder." Mason turned his unseeing eyes to the rising sun. "A man's true wealth isn't in what he takes, but in what he protects. This valley, these people, the peace we've won, that's worth more than all the gold in Wyoming territory." He fingered his guns one last time, then hung them up beside the door. The legend of Deadeye Mason had grown tonight, but the blind rancher, who'd learned to see through darkness, he had simpler treasures to guard. Thunder Valley woke to a changed world. The morning sun revealed the night's battle scars, scorched earth from the fire barrels, bullet-riddled buildings, spent cartridges glinting in the grass. But it also showed something else. People coming, together, rebuilding what had been broken. Mason sat on his porch, listening to the sounds of recovery. Hammers rang as Thompson and his boys repaired the damaged barn. Sarah's voice carried from the kitchen where she helped Martha Davidson tend to the wounded. Even old Jake was back at his store, telling wide-eyed customers how the blind rancher had saved the valley. "Quite a legend you've built," Sheriff Burke said, settling into the chair beside Mason. "Territory Marshal's coming to collect Raven and Harper. Says he's never seen anything like it. One blind man and a handful of ranchers taking down the biggest land-grabbing operation in Wyoming." Mason nodded slightly. "Valley did the work. I just taught people to listen to what it was telling them. And the gold. Harper's been raving about army payroll, stolen money. Some stories are better left in the dark," Mason said quietly, "where only a blind man can find them." Burke understood. Some mysteries, like the way a blind man could outshoot 23 killers, were better left unexplained. They kept men honest, kept them wondering what other secrets Thunder Valley might hold. The musical targets still hung in their places, singing softly in the morning breeze. Mason had no intention of taking them down. They'd serve as a reminder that strength comes in many forms, and that sometimes a man had to lose his sight to truly learn how to see. Weeks after the battle, Mason stood at Catherine's grave, Sarah by his side. The valley had healed, its scars covered by fresh grass and new paint. But its song had changed. Every echo now carried the memory of the night a blind man had brought. "Justice in the dark, found something in the attic," Sarah said softly. "Mother's old journal. She wrote about that day, about why she came to stop you and Raven." She touched her father's arm. "She said she knew you'd make the right choice, even before you did." Mason smiled gently. "Your mother always saw clearer than anyone. Taught me that real sight isn't in your eyes, it's in your heart." From the valley came the sound of Thompson's boys practicing with the musical targets. They'd begged Mason to teach them his ways, to learn how to hear what the valley was telling them. Other ranchers had started setting up their own targets, turning Thunder Valley into a place where sound itself stood guard against evil. "The gold's still out there, isn't it?" Sarah asked, "in a place only a blind man could find." Mason turned his unseeing eyes toward the distant peaks. "Some treasures are worth more than gold, girl. This valley, these people, the legacy your mother left us." He squeezed her hand. "Those are the only riches worth protecting." A musical target rang out, clear and true, struck dead center by one of Thompson's boys. Mason nodded in satisfaction. Thunder Valley's song would continue, passed down through generations who learned to see with their ears and fight with their hearts. Some said the army gold was still hidden in the high canyon. Others claimed Mason had given it to the poor, or that it had never existed at all. But in Thunder Valley, they knew the truth, that the real treasure wasn't gold at all, but the legend of a blind man who'd taught them all to see in the dark.